At 7:42 in the morning on May 27th in the year 1940, Captain Jack Churchill knelt behind a broken stone wall near the small French village of Lepinette, watching 5 German soldiers move through the pale mist toward his hidden position. He was 33 years old. 14 years had passed since his days at Sandhurst, yet he still had no confirmed combat kills. Germany had crushed Poland in 36 days. Now their tanks were ripping across France at nearly 40 miles each day. The British Expeditionary Force was falling back toward the coast. Churchill had lost 11 men in the past 72 hours. German units had stronger tanks, better aircraft, and tighter coordination. British soldiers were dying across every route leading to Dunkirk. The retreat was dissolving into desperation. Officers tossed classified papers into roadside fires. Sergeants buried heavy gear that could not be carried. Exhausted soldiers abandoned rifles simply to run faster toward the beaches. But Jack Churchill was not running. In his hands he held a 6-foot English longbow. It carried a draw weight of 70 pounds, and in the hands of a master could reach 200 yards. Churchill was a master archer. 11 months earlier he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo. He had placed 26th out of 63 competitors from 14 nations. Not the top score, but skilled enough to punch an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. Skilled enough to kill a man before that man even heard a shot. The German patrol was now only 30 yards away. Close enough for a clean strike. Churchill studied the sergeant leading the patrol. The man moved with the calm precision of a veteran, likely someone who had survived the Polish campaign. The sergeant scanned hedges and windows, searching for rifles, machine guns, or grenades. He did not expect a medieval weapon. Churchill drew the bowstring back until it reached his ear. The wood creaked under the strain. His fingers locked into the same anchor point he had used thousands of times in practice. He had made this shot many times in silent fields, though never with a human life at the far end. The arrow left the bow. The German sergeant collapsed without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest. It became the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. It would be the last longbow kill of the Second World War. It happened because one British officer refused to believe that modern weapons erased the value of ancient skill. The British Army had never known how to handle Jack Churchill. He had graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma. He had spent years learning the disciplined routines of an infantry officer, then walked away from the army in 1936 because peacetime soldiering crushed him with boredom. He had worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi in Kenya. He had appeared in films as an archer and a bagpipe player, even earning a small role in The Thief of Baghdad. He once rode a motorcycle 1,500 miles through Burma and India and crashed into a water buffalo on a lonely rural road. When war erupted in September 1939, Churchill returned to his regiment without hesitation, but he did not return as an ordinary officer. He brought his longbow from competition. He brought his Scottish broadsword with a basket hilt like those carried by his ancestors. He brought a set of Highland bagpipes that he had taught himself to play during long nights in Burma. Many officers saw him as eccentric or possibly unstable. His commanders believed he was an unpredictable risk. The War Office had no rules for officers who insisted on carrying medieval weapons into battle against German armor armed with 88mm guns. Churchill ignored their doubts. He had studied military history deeply. He understood that rifles outranged longbows at distance, and that a Morse could fire 15 rounds each minute, while a longbow might lose 10. But he also understood something modern planners overlooked. At close range, in the shock of an ambush, and in the terror of direct combat, psychological force mattered as much as firepower. A warrior charging with a broadsword and a Highland cry could break an enemy mind faster than a rifle shot from cover. And a silent arrow striking before a sound was heard created fear more powerful than any bullet. The British evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th in 1940. Most left behind their guns, vehicles, equipment and pride. They returned defeated and bracing for invasion. Jack Churchill returned with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. He had shielded the retreat of his company. He had killed German soldiers using weapons older than gunpowder, and he was only beginning. Within weeks of returning from Dunkirk, he volunteered for a new experimental formation, the Commandos. Training would be harsher than anything the British Army had ever attempted. Missions would be risky raids into German-held territory, and losses were expected to be high. Churchill requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos approved. By December 1941, he would step onto a frozen Norwegian beach at dawn bagpipes, wailing into the icy wind sword, raised high ready to prove again that the oldest ways of war still held power. Churchill entered the commando ranks at once because the mission of this new force matched the restless fire inside him. The idea behind the Commandos was simple but merciless. Small groups of volunteers would strike deep into German-held territory, then vanish before the enemy could respond. They would destroy rail lines, fuel depots, communications posts, and coastal fortifications. They would raid garrisons, snatch documents, kill enemy troops, and cripple German infrastructure wherever possible. Only volunteers were accepted because the training pushed every man beyond his limits. Churchill joined No. 3 Commando in late 1940 and dived into the brutal training routine with the same intensity he brought to battle. The training grounds in the Scottish Highlands around Achnacarry forced men to march 30 miles each day, carrying full packs across steep, rocky terrain. They practiced landing operations in freezing waters that numbed limbs within seconds. They learned silent killing techniques with knives, garrots, and bare hands, and practiced live fire assaults with bullets snapping inches above their helmets. Anyone who lagged behind was dismissed in shame and returned to his unit. Churchill surprised many because he was older than most, yet stronger, faster, and more relentless. He outmarched younger men, he shot with unnerving precision, he fought with raw aggression, but the skills that truly set him apart were those no other commando possessed. He could strike a target at 200 yards with his longbow. He could play bagpipes while advancing into danger without fear. He carried a broadsword with the skill of a warrior from a forgotten age. At first, some men laughed lightly at him or whispered that he was unbalanced. Others were uneasy in his presence. But as the days passed and the exercises became harsher, the men saw that Churchill did not carry these old weapons as decoration. He carried them because he understood the psychology of war. He had learned something that modern officers often forgot. A German soldier expecting rifle fire felt prepared. But a German soldier who saw a sword waving in a charge or heard bagpipes howling through smoke would hesitate in pure disbelief. And in battle, one heartbeat of hesitation could be fatal. By the autumn of 1941, Churchill had become second in command of No. 3 Commando. The unit had carried out small probing raids along the Norwegian coastline, but nothing of strategic weight. Then in November, orders arrived from Combined Operations Headquarters. No. 3 Commando would lead a major assault on the German stronghold at Vågsøy, a small island guarding access to important fjords along the Norwegian coast. The mission was named Operation Archery. Vågsøy mattered because German ships used those fjords to transport iron ore from Sweden to Germany. The island held around 150 German soldiers, 4 coastal artillery guns, and an anti-aircraft battery. The town of South Vågsøy also held fish oil factories that produced glycerin used for explosives. The plan called for a dawn assault on December 27th in the year 1941. Royal Navy ships would pound the island with shells. Royal Air Force bombers would provide cover. Commandos would land on multiple beaches at the same time and overwhelm the defenders before they could respond. Churchill studied the intelligence reports with deep focus. The German positions were well fortified. They had machine guns pointed toward the approaches. They had mortars and prepared trenches. The coastal guns could destroy landing craft before they reached the sand. The attack had to be fast, violent, and perfectly timed. Churchill requested to lead the first wave onto Moy Island, a small defensive outpost protecting the entrance to South Vogsoy. Permission was granted. He also requested to bring his sword and play his bagpipes during the assault. This request was also granted, though some senior officers shook their heads in disbelief. On the night before the raid, Churchill checked every piece of his gear. The broadsword was sharpened. The pipes were tuned. He carried grenades, a revolver, and a Thompson submachine gun, but he intended to begin the assault with music and steel, not bullets. The commandos boarded their ships on Christmas Day 1941 and sailed north through cold black waters toward Norway. Ice formed on railings, and the breath of every man hung as white vapor. The men prepared their weapons, wrote letters home, or lay awake imagining what waited for them. Churchill spent the voyage studying maps and rehearsing hand signals. Under his command were 105 commandos, who carried the responsibility of taking out the German shore battery on Moy Island within 10 minutes of landing. If they failed, the whole mission would be destroyed because the German guns would tear apart the landing craft heading for South Vogsoy. At 8:45 in the morning on December 27th, the ships reached the launch point 12 miles from the Norwegian coast. Landing craft were lowered into the water. The men climbed down the nets with their packs and weapons. Churchill stood at the bow of the lead craft bagpipes, held ready sword at his belt. The landing craft moved through thick smoke, dropped by Hampton bombers to blind German gunners. The cruiser Coldate, Shimeskenya, hurled 6-inch shells toward the shore battery, the blasts flashing across the dark winter sky. Churchill braced himself as Moy Island drew closer. The other men crouched low inside the craft, but Churchill remained upright. The shore approached 200 yards, then 150, then 100. At 8:48, the ramp hit the rocky beach. Before anyone else moved, Churchill stepped into the freezing surf and began to play the march of the Cameron men. The sound of the pipes cut through the chaos, shocking friend and enemy alike. It was a sound no German expected to hear on a snow-covered beach in occupied Norway. Then Churchill set down his pipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, hurled it forward, and drew his sword as he charged inland, calling his men forward to begin the assault. Churchill marched ahead of his men across the icy beach, while explosions shook the air and machine gun fire cracked from hidden German positions, but he did not lower his head or break his stride as the sound of the march of the Cameron men drifted over the shoreline like a challenge. The commandos moved behind him using the steel sides of the landing craft for cover, while Churchill walked openly through the surf with his pipes still echoing in the winter wind. When he finished the tune, he placed the pipes down, stepped forward, and flung a grenade toward the nearest German emplacement, then pulled free his broadsword and charged up the rocky rise, calling for his men to advance. The violence of the assault shocked the defenders. They had trained to face rifles and submachine guns, not a sword-wielding officer running straight at them. The commandos surged behind Churchill with Thompson guns and Enfield rifles firing in rapid bursts. The Germans attempted to regroup, but the smoke, the noise, and the unexpected ferocity of the attack broke their rhythm. Within moments, Churchill and his men were inside the first set of fortifications, clearing bunkers and knocking out the coastal guns. The 4 artillery pieces were destroyed using explosive charges placed by the commandos. The anti-aircraft battery was captured after a brief fight. The German commander was taken prisoner along with 15 others. Churchill appeared everywhere during these minutes of chaos. His sword flashed as he signaled his men. He darted through trenches calling orders above the noise. He encouraged men who faltered. He directed grenades toward resisting pockets of Germans. By 9:00, Moy Island belonged to the British. As soon as the final position was secure, Churchill received a message from the assault force at South Vogsoy. The situation there was collapsing. German reinforcements had arrived during the night, increasing the strength of the garrison beyond what intelligence had predicted. Fierce street fighting had broken out. Snipers fired from rooftops. Machine guns swept the open streets. Commandos were pinned behind stone walls and inside shattered buildings, unable to push forward. Churchill did not hesitate. He gathered the men who could still fight, commandeered a landing craft, and crossed the narrow stretch of water to South Vogsoy. When he arrived, the town was in turmoil. Gunfire cracked from upper windows. Mortars thudded into courtyards. Smoke drifted through narrow alleys while British troops tried to advance step by step. Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, the commander of the main assault, asked Churchill to break the stalemate. Churchill analyzed the approaching routes and chose a narrow side street for a flanking attack. Sword in hand, he sprinted ahead using the corners and doorways as cover, while his men followed close behind. The Germans holding that section were forced to fall back because they had not expected an attack from that direction. With each retreating step, the British regained momentum. House by house and room by room, the commandos pushed the enemy through the town. Fighting continued into mid-afternoon. The fish oil factories were destroyed with demolition charges, sending flames and smoke high above the harbor. German codebooks and important documents were captured. More than 100 German soldiers were taken prisoner. The cost was heavy. 17 British commandos lost their lives. 53 were wounded. Churchill emerged without a single injury, though his sword was stained from the day's fighting and his bagpipes were still intact. The raid on Vogsoy became the first major commando triumph of the war, and it carried massive consequences. It proved that small aggressive units could strike Germany hard on its occupied coasts. It proved that psychological shock and fearless leadership could overcome heavily defended positions. And it reinforced the legend that Churchill's ancient weapons were not madness, but tools that delivered results. The German High Command reacted with fury. Adolf Hitler ordered immediate reinforcements to every coastal village across Norway, and soon 30,000 German troops were tied up guarding fjords and islands that once required only small garrisons. These men could have been fighting in Russia or in North Africa, but now they were immobilized by the threat of more raids. Churchill's reputation grew across the British military. Stories spread quickly. The officer who played bagpipes into battle, the man who charged with a sword. Newspapers picked up the tales and turned him into a living symbol of fearless defiance. When other commanders planned operations, his name often appeared on the list of officers they requested. By the summer of 1943, Churchill had been promoted to Command No. 2 Commando. His next operations would take him from the sands of Sicily to the rugged mountains of Italy, and he would soon carry out one of the most astonishing captures of the entire war. He would make 42 German soldiers surrender to 2 men. The Allied invasion of Sicily, called Operation Husky, began on July 9, 1943. It was the largest amphibious landing in history at that time. 160,000 Allied troops landed on the southern beaches within 3 days. Their goal was to push Italy out of the war and open a new front against Germany. Churchill landed at Catania on the eastern side of the island, leading his commandos ashore with sword, bow, and bagpipes. His men no longer questioned his equipment. They knew what he could do. The campaign in Sicily was relentless. German parachute units and armored divisions fought with determination. Towns perched on hills became defensive fortresses. Roads that twisted along the mountains turned into natural ambushes. Yet Churchill led his commandos through these obstacles, gathering intelligence, raiding positions, and striking supply lines before withdrawing into the hills. By September, Sicily had fallen, and the Allies shifted their attention to mainland Italy, where the beaches near Salerno would soon erupt in fire. The invasion of mainland Italy began with the landings at Salerno on September 9th in the year 1943, and Churchill and No. 2 Commando were placed near the center of the unfolding battle. Intelligence had suggested that the beaches south of Naples would be lightly defended because the Germans were expected to hold their forces closer to Rome. This proved disastrously wrong. As soon as the British and American forces touched the shore, they were met by fierce resistance from German artillery, tanks, and well-placed infantry. Shells exploded across the sand, and mortars rained down on the landing craft, forcing troops to take cover behind whatever scrap of earth they could find. Churchill and his men were ordered to secure the town of Vitry-sur-Mer, which controlled a crucial road and rail junction overlooking the western half of the Bay of Salerno. If the Germans seized Vitry, they could direct devastating artillery fire onto the beaches, turning the landing into a slaughter. For 5 days and nights, Churchill and his commandos held their ground. They fought from crumbling buildings, from trenches in orchards, and from shattered stone terraces. They repelled repeated infantry assaults and tank probes. They called in naval gunfire on advancing German units when their own ammunition ran low. Dust, smoke, and the thunder of artillery filled the air each hour of every day, and still they held Vitry because losing it would unravel the entire invasion. On the night of September 14th, Churchill received a new order. German forces had taken control of high ground above the small town of Melina. From those hills, a German observation post was directing accurate artillery fire onto Allied positions. This single post was causing chaos and had to be silenced. Churchill studied the terrain under faint moonlight. A direct attack was impossible. The slopes were steep, exposed, and covered by machine guns and mortars. A large force would be spotted long before reaching the top. Churchill made a decision that matched both his courage and his unconventional thinking. He would take only one corporal and attempt to infiltrate the German position in total darkness. 2 men could move silently where hundreds could not. Shortly after midnight, Churchill and the corporal slipped away from the British lines. They moved through deep shadows, sliding along stone walls and crawling through drainage ditches to avoid the German sentries. The night was pitch black. The Germans were confident. They did not imagine that 2 men would attempt such a daring infiltration. As dawn approached, Churchill spotted faint glowing embers from cigarettes at a mortar post. German soldiers stood talking quietly, unaware that death approached from the dark. Churchill drew his broadsword and stepped forward like a spectre from a forgotten age. The Germans froze. Faced with a sword-wielding officer emerging from the gloom, they surrendered instantly. Churchill then used the lanyard of his revolver like a rope to lead the prisoner toward the next position. At each post he repeated the same pattern. He appeared silently. He revealed himself with absolute confidence. He demanded surrender. Each time the German soldiers obeyed, too shocked and bewildered to resist. By full daylight, Churchill and his corporal had captured 42 German soldiers, including the entire mortar team. They gathered the prisoners into a column and escorted them back down the narrow path. The lightly wounded were placed on makeshift carts and pushed by their fellow captives. Churchill later compared the scene to something from the era of Napoleon. For this extraordinary action, he received the Distinguished Service Order, though official notes avoided mentioning that the entire capture had been achieved with a sword. By September 20th, the Salerno beachhead was finally secure, and the Allies began their slow march north through Italy. The Gustav Line, the series of heavily fortified German positions, sprawled across mountains, and valleys blocked their advance and turned the campaign into a war of grueling attrition. Churchill continued leading his commandos on raids deep into enemy-held territories, disrupting communications, ambushing patrols, and gathering intelligence. His name became legend among German soldiers. Some called him the Wild Englishman. Others whispered that he was a berserker. Many refused to believe he was real, yet they feared the stories, and in the spring of 1944, he was sent to a new battlefield where those stories would grow even darker. Churchill and No. 2 Commando were transferred to Yugoslavia, where German occupation forces fought Tito's partisans in one of the most brutal theaters of the war. The mountains were unforgiving. The fighting was savage. Entire villages burned during reprisals. Captured fighters were often executed. The Germans committed more than 500,000 troops to the region and still struggled to contain the partisan resistance. The British government decided to support the partisans with weapons supplies and experienced combat units. Churchill arrived on the Adriatic island of Vis in April 1944. From there he launched raids along the Dalmatian coast. He studied partisan tactics, navigated steep mountain paths, and coordinated attacks on German supply routes. The partisans admired his bravery and were astonished by his confidence. Wherever Churchill fought, he carried his sword and bagpipes, and he inspired both fear and loyalty. The Germans felt the pressure of these new raids and increased their guards and patrols. They knew something dangerous had entered their sector. In May 1944, Churchill received the order to capture the German-held island of Brac, which guarded vital shipping lanes. A strong garrison occupied fortified positions overlooking the beaches. Churchill assembled a mixed force of British commandos and more than 1,000 partisans. The landing was unopposed because the Germans had fallen back to the hills. Churchill urged an immediate nighttime assault, but the partisan commanders hesitated when they saw the German fortifications and refused to advance until morning. Churchill was furious, but he had no authority to compel them, so he waited through the long night, knowing the enemy now had time to prepare. At dawn, the attack began. Churchill led elements of No. 40 Commando in a direct assault, while No. 43 Commando attempted a flanking maneuver. The partisans stayed near the landing zone and did not join the charge. The Germans unleashed machine gun fire and mortar rounds. The attack stalled under the relentless bombardment. Churchill played his bagpipes to rally his men as explosions shook the hillside. A German mortar team adjusted its aim and fired directly into the cluster of commandos surrounding their commander. The blasts killed or wounded every man except Churchill, who survived by chance because he was standing apart playing his pipes. Suddenly, he was alone on the slope in enemy territory with ammunition nearly gone and German soldiers advancing. He sat on a rock, lifted his pipes, and played Will Ye No Come Back Again, a mournful Scottish tune that echoed across the battlefield as the Germans closed in around him. Churchill played his mournful Scottish tune as German soldiers crept toward him through the smoke and rubble, unsure whether they were witnessing madness bravery or a ghost from another age. When a grenade landed nearby and exploded, he was knocked unconscious and taken prisoner by troops, who were too stunned to kill the lone bagpipe-playing officer sitting among the bodies of his men. The Germans transported him to Berlin, believing that anyone named Churchill must be related to the British Prime Minister. They questioned him aggressively, hoping for valuable intelligence, but discovered he had no connection to Winston Churchill and no access to high-level secrets. From Berlin, he was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of the capital, a grim facility used to imprison political enemies, resistance fighters, and individuals considered valuable for potential prisoner exchanges. Churchill was placed in a special compound known as Zellen, Bau Block, alongside diplomats, military officers, and men suspected of having ties to prominent Allied leaders. Among them were 3 Royal Air Force officers who had taken part in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3 in March 1944. 50 of their comrades had been executed by the Gestapo after that escape, and only these 3 had been spared because they were seen as bargaining chips. Churchill wasted no time planning a new escape. He studied the guards, the routines, the layout, and every weakness in the perimeter. In a small garden area near the fence, prisoners had limited access for daily chores. Churchill saw its potential. He began digging a tunnel from a drainage ditch concealed behind compost heaps. He and his fellow conspirators used spoons, bits of metal, and their own hands to claw through the earth. The work was slow, silent, and dangerous. Each night, they carried dirt under their clothing and scattered it around the garden. Over weeks, the tunnel stretched more than 110 meters, passing under the electrified fence and emerging in woods beyond the camp. On September 23rd in the year 1944, Churchill and 4 British prisoners crawled into the darkness and emerged free men on the other side. They scattered across the countryside. Churchill paired with squadron leader Bertram James, one of the Great Escape survivors. Their plan was desperate but simple. They would walk north nearly 200 kilometers to the Baltic coast, then find a fishing boat to carry them to neutral Sweden. For 2 weeks they moved at night, hiding in barns, ditches, and thick brush during daylight. They stole vegetables from fields and drank from streams. They avoided towns and roads. Their clothes were torn and thin, and the cold grew sharper as autumn tightened its grip. Still, they pressed forward, driven by a fierce refusal to surrender. They reached the outskirts of Rostock, close to the coast, before their luck ended. A small German patrol approached and demanded papers. Churchill and James had none. They were arrested and identified as escaped prisoners. This time, the Germans did not return them to Sachsenhausen. Instead, Churchill was sent to a camp in the Austrian Alps, far from the approaching Allied lines. Winter settled in, snow buried the mountains, food grew scarce. Guards became nervous as news spread of Soviet advances and Allied breakthroughs in France. Prisoners heard rumors about the collapse of German supply lines and the destruction of cities. Churchill waited, watched, and listened as the Third Reich crumbled around him. In April 1945, with German defeat imminent, the SS gathered Churchill and roughly 140 prominent prisoners and marched them south toward the Tyrol region of Italy, hoping to use them as bargaining chips or possibly planning to execute them before liberation. The prisoners were exhausted, hungry, and uncertain whether each day would be their last. But fate shifted unexpectedly. As the marching column passed near the village of Niederdorf, the prisoners approached Wehrmacht officers and expressed fear that the SS intended to kill them. The officers conferred and realized they too distrusted the SS. Captain Richard von Alvensleben, commanding nearby German army troops, decided to intervene. His soldiers surrounded the SS guards. After a tense confrontation, the SS backed down and abandoned the prisoners. The war had turned upside down. Now German soldiers were protecting Allied prisoners from other Germans. When the SS withdrew, the prisoners were effectively free, though stranded in a remote valley. Most waited for Allied troops to arrive. But Churchill refused to sit idle. He had been a prisoner too long. He had escaped, once been recaptured, dragged across Europe, and marched through mountains. He would not remain still while the war still raged. He set off south on foot, walking through the Alps toward Allied lines, covering 150 kilometers, despite having no food, no weapon, and an injured ankle. For 8 days, he moved through villages, forests, and mountain passes, avoiding stragglers and retreating units. At last he reached Verona, where he encountered an American armored reconnaissance unit. The Americans stared at the ragged man, who emerged from the mountains claiming to be a British commando lieutenant colonel. He had no documents, but his authority, his calm voice, and his incredible account convinced them. They transported him safely back to British command. Churchill reached home in May 1945 as Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was finished. Concentration camps were liberated. Cities lay in ruins, but to Churchill the conflict was not over. Japan still fought in the Pacific. British troops were dying in Burma, Malaya, and the islands of Southeast Asia. Churchill requested immediate transfer to the Pacific Theater. He wanted one more battle, one more chance to draw his sword charge a beach and play his bagpipes against an enemy line. His request was approved, and he boarded a ship bound for Burma. He had no idea that 2 atomic bombs would end the war before he ever arrived on the battlefield. Churchill was somewhere above India when the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima on August 6th in the year 1945, and in a single blinding flash, the war he had prepared himself to continue fighting for years was suddenly nearing its end. One American B-29 bomber dropped a weapon that killed 80,000 people in an instant. 3 days later, another bomb destroyed Nagasaki, and on August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War was finished, but Churchill received the news not with relief, but with a strange and almost bitter disappointment. He had spent months preparing for the invasion of Japan. He had studied their defenses, their tactics, and their ability to fight to the last man. He had planned to storm another beach with his sword drawn, and his bagpipes screaming above the thunder of enemy fire, just as he had done in Norway, Sicily, Italy, and Yugoslavia. Now there would be no such battle and no final test of everything he believed about courage and war. He reportedly said that without the American atomic bombs, the war could have lasted another 10 years, revealing a truth about his nature. He was a man forged for conflict, a man whose life gained purpose in chaos, and whose spirit burned brightest when danger surrounded him. Peace was a world that did not suit him. After the war, the British military struggled to find a place for Jack Churchill. He was too bold for paperwork, too restless for quiet garrison life, and too famous and unconventional to disappear into any simple administrative job. His record was astonishing. He had earned the Distinguished Service Order with Bar, the Military Cross with Bar. He had fought in France, Norway, Sicily, Italy, Yugoslavia. He had captured 42 enemy soldiers with a sword. He had escaped from a concentration camp and marched across mountains to reach friendly forces. Such a man could not be placed behind a desk without losing the very spirit that made him great. Yet the army needed him where tasks were dull, not dangerous, and so he found himself assigned to administrative work in Burma, where he supervised the slow shift from war to peace. He disliked the monotony. He disliked the calm. He missed the life of raids and missions and the quiet, deadly focus that only war had given him. He requested transfers to more active commands whenever possible. He volunteered repeatedly for challenging roles, although none matched what he had known during the war. By 1946, the world he had fought to protect was changing swiftly. The British Empire was collapsing. India was demanding independence. Palestine was erupting with fighting. Across Africa and Asia, nationalist movements were rising. Churchill was transferred to Palestine in 1947, where he became second in command of the 1st Battalion Highland Light Infantry. The region was on the edge of violence. Jewish survivors of the Holocaust poured into the land, seeking a homeland of their own. Arab Palestinians feared displacement, and uprising followed. The British forces attempting to keep order found themselves attacked by both sides. Bombings, ambushes, assassinations. Each week, the threat increased. In April 1948, a Jewish medical convoy traveling to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus was ambushed by Arab fighters who surrounded the vehicles with rifles and burning bottles. Doctors, nurses, and students were trapped inside the buses. British security forces failed to intervene in time, and 77 people were killed in what became known as the Hadassah Convoy Massacre. Churchill was not present at the attack, but he immediately became involved in its aftermath because the surviving medical staff now remained isolated at the hospital, far behind hostile lines with no safe passage in or out. Supplies were running out. Communication was almost impossible, and the fear of another attack loomed over everyone. Churchill took charge of the evacuation. He negotiated with British commanders, Jewish leaders, and Arab authorities. He coordinated every detail of the route. He personally oversaw the movement through contested territory, relying not on force but on his calm confidence and his ability to speak to enemies without showing fear. He managed to evacuate 700 doctors, students, and patients safely from Mount Scopus. When asked how he maintained control in such a volatile environment, he simply answered that people were less likely to shoot someone who smiled at them. It was the same philosophy he carried into war. Confidence and presence could disarm opponents as effectively as gunfire. After the British withdrawal from Palestine on May 14, 1948, and the immediate outbreak of the Arab-Israeli War, Churchill returned to Britain, unsure of what the future held. He was 41 years old and had lived a life more intense than entire armies combined. He had survived battles, raids, captivity, escapes, and chaos. He had earned medals that others only dreamed of, and still he could not imagine what peace should look like. The British Army placed him in various training and instructional roles. He trained young soldiers in commando tactics, teaching them the lessons he had carved into himself through years of war. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, simply to feel the rush of risk once again. But none of these duties could replace what he had lost. The world had moved beyond the type of war that Churchill embodied. He needed a new challenge, a new purpose, something adventurous and strange enough to stir that old fire inside him. He would eventually find it, but not in the battlefield. The man who had charged German positions with a sword and played bagpipes under mortar fire was about to discover a passion no one in the world would ever have expected. Churchill did not know that the greatest transformation of his life was waiting far from the battlefield, in a world where the only waves were made of water rather than gunfire, and where the only battles were against nature itself. By the mid-1950s, he had settled into a strange rhythm of peace, yet restlessness followed him like a shadow. He had served as an instructor, as a planner, and as a mentor to younger soldiers, but none of it could match the intensity that war had once provided. The man who had escaped Nazi camps and stormed fortified beaches with sword and bagpipes was still searching for something that could stir his soul with the same force that battle had. On July 21st, 1955, he stood on the banks of the River Severn in Gloucestershire, England, holding a homemade surfboard. Locals stared at him with disbelief because the river was known for its muddy water, its tidal surge, and its dangerous currents. Twice each day, a tidal bore swept up the river from the Bristol Channel, forming a crashing line of water that rolled inland for miles. No one had ever attempted to ride it, yet Churchill waited on the bank with the same calm anticipation he once held before a raid. The wave appeared as a thin white crest moving swiftly against the natural flow of the river. Churchill paddled into the center of the water, placed himself in front of the roaring surge, and balanced on the rough wooden board. When the wave lifted him, he rose and began riding it upstream for more than a mile. People watching from the banks could hardly believe what they saw. A decorated war hero riding a river wave as if it were an ocean swell. It was exactly the sort of activity that suited him, unpredictable, risky, and full of challenge. He continued to ride the Severn Bore whenever he could, becoming one of the first men in British history to surf in any form. His transition into civilian life finally began to take shape. 4 years later, in 1959, he retired from the British Army with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel after more than 3 decades of service across continents. He had lived through the greatest war the world had ever seen and walked through fire again and again. Now, at the age of 52, he finally allowed himself to explore the quieter corners of life. But even his retirement was marked by the same peculiar energy that had shaped everything he did. Churchill became fascinated with radio-controlled model boats. He built intricate replicas of warships, fitting them with small engines and guiding them across the ponds near his home. Children and adults from the community would gather to watch as he maneuvered them with practiced precision. He restored old steam-powered boats and sailed them along the Thames between Richmond and Oxford, treating each voyage as if it were another mission. He continued playing his bagpipes at military ceremonies and reunions, standing proudly among veterans who had served under him or alongside him during the darkest years of the war. Yet even in moments of calm, Churchill remained unmistakably himself. He became famous among commuters for one particular ritual. Each evening while riding the train home from London, he would open a window as the train neared his house and toss his briefcase onto the grass beside the tracks. Passengers would gasp, thinking he had lost his mind, but Churchill had measured the distance carefully. His garden bordered the railway line, and the briefcase landed safely inside it every time, sparing him the trouble of carrying it from the station. Those who knew him understood that this small act captured the pure essence of the man. Direct, fearless, practical, and entirely unwilling to follow rules that did not suit him. Though he rarely boasted about his wartime achievements, Churchill was generous with stories when asked. His son Malcolm would later recall that his father spoke openly about the war, especially in the evening with a glass of wine in hand, yet he never embellished his deeds. He did not need to. The truth was already beyond imagination. As the years passed, Churchill watched the world shift into a new age. The British Empire dissolved. The Cold War divided nations with threats far greater than rifles and tanks. New weapons emerged. Jet aircraft roared across the sky. Guided missiles replaced artillery. Atomic power cast a shadow over global politics. Warfare evolved so quickly that the battles Churchill had fought began to feel like legends from another era. Tanks, swords, and trench raids were replaced by machines capable of destroying cities in seconds. Yet even as the world turned toward a future dominated by technology, the memory of Churchill's fearless spirit refused to fade. He lived quietly in Surrey, spending his days sailing model boats, practicing his pipes, and enjoying the simple peace that had eluded him during the war years. Still, he remained a figure larger than life. A man who once charged German guns with a broadsword. A man who freed himself from Nazi captivity and walked across mountains to rejoin the fight. A man who believed deeply in courage and believed even more deeply in living life without fear. On March 8, 1996, Churchill passed away at the age of 89, surrounded by family. His death marked the end of a life so extraordinary that newspapers struggled to describe it. One wrote that if a novelist had invented him, no one would have believed the story, and it was true. He was a man who turned ancient weapons into modern terror, who used a longbow in a world of tanks and aircraft, who fought battles as if he had stepped from the pages of a forgotten saga, who proved again and again that courage, imagination, and an unbreakable spirit could change the course of a moment, even if not the course of history. His legacy lived on not only in medals and military archives, but in the hearts of every soldier who refused to accept limits, in the special forces whose lineage traced back to the commandos he helped shape, and in every person who ever heard the story of Mad Jack Churchill and felt the spark of something fierce and bright inside themselves. He was a reminder that one soul driven by pure conviction can carve a path through impossibility and leave behind a legend that time itself cannot erase. Jack Churchill's story did not fade when he passed from this world on March 8th, in the year 1996, at the age of 89, because his life was so unbelievable, so bold, and so deeply human, that it refused to settle quietly into the pages of history. Even after death, people struggled to understand him. Reporters wrote that if he had never existed, no writer would dare invent such a man. How could anyone imagine a soldier who fought with a longbow and a broadsword in the age of machine guns? How could anyone dream up an officer who marched into battle playing bagpipes while shells exploded around him? How could anyone believe a man who captured 42 German soldiers using a sword and pure audacity? Yet Churchill lived all of it without exaggeration, without decoration, and without any need for myth, because he himself was already larger than myth. His life stretched across the greatest conflict mankind had ever known, and he left his mark in every theater he touched. From France to Norway, from Sicily to Italy, from Yugoslavia to the mountains of Austria, every corner of the war somehow carried his footprints. What made his legend powerful was not only his courage, but the way he carried that courage. He never sought fame, he never demanded glory, he never asked to be recognized. When people questioned him about his deeds, he told the truth plainly, as if it were ordinary. There was nothing ordinary about it. He killed with a longbow in a modern war. He charged machine gun nests with a sword. He played pipes to rally men who believed they were moments from death. He survived capture, broke out of a concentration camp, crossed mountains on foot, and returned to battle because he could not bear to stand still while others fought. He rescued hundreds in Palestine using nothing but calm negotiation and a fearless smile. He rode river waves on a surfboard at nearly 50 years old, simply because the challenge called to him. He threw his briefcase from a train onto his own lawn because walking from the station felt tedious and life was too short for tedious things. He built model boats, sailed old steam vessels, and filled quiet evenings with the sound of pipes. All of it together formed a life unlike any other. The world changed around him through the decades that followed the war. Nations rose and fell, empires evaporated, technology leapt forward at impossible speed, nuclear weapons reshaped the planet, rockets left the atmosphere, computers began rewriting the meaning of communication and conflict. But through these shifting ages, one truth remained. People still whispered about Mad Jack Churchill. They whispered because his story was not really about weapons or battles. It was about the human spirit. It was about the ancient truth that courage and imagination could break open any boundary. Churchill showed that bravery could frighten armies, that humor could disarm even sworn enemies, that tradition and skill could outmatch machinery when carried by a soul unwilling to bow. He proved that in a world drowning in fear, one individual could rise above it, stand alone at the front of a landing craft, and play the pipes toward a fortress, and in doing so ignite the courage of everyone who followed him. His legacy lived on in the Special Operations Forces, whose existence could be traced to the commandos he helped shape. These elite units carried forward the same spirit, that Churchill embodied the belief that small groups of trained men could change the course of events through speed, precision, and relentless will. His influence reached beyond the battlefield too. Every storyteller, every historian, every veteran who shared tales of impossible odds carried a piece of him. His story inspired not just soldiers but ordinary people who saw in him the reminder that life was meant to be lived fully and without fear. Courage, he once said, was not the absence of fear but the mastery of it, and he mastered it again and again. In the years after his passing, former commandos, younger soldiers and admirers from around the world visited his resting place to honor the man who made them believe in something greater. They placed flowers, they played pipes in his memory. They told stories of the time he stood alone on a hilltop in Yugoslavia, playing a Scottish lament while surrounded by enemy soldiers who could not bring themselves to shoot him. They recalled the first longbow kill of the war. They spoke of the raid on Vogsoy, the capture of Brack, the escape from Sachsenhausen, and the march through the Alps. They spoke of his spirit, the quiet fire behind his eyes that said, "No matter what comes, I will walk toward it." By the late 20th century, as documentaries, books, and military instructors retold his story, the world began to see Churchill not only as a warrior, but as a symbol of something timeless, a reminder that modernity does not erase the old ways, a reminder that courage can come in any form, a reminder that strength of heart will always matter more than strength of weapon. And so the legend of Jack Churchill continued to grow long after he was gone, carried forward by those who refused to let him vanish from memory. His life burned like a torch held high in a storm, a torch that helped guide soldiers and dreamers alike. He once said that any man who goes into battle without his sword is improperly dressed. It was a joke, perhaps, but it also held truth because Churchill believed that life itself was a battlefield, and one should meet it with dignity, character, and boldness. When the final chapter of his life closed, the world did not lose a soldier. It lost a reminder of what true courage looks like. A man who walked through the deadliest moments of history not with fear but with music rising behind him and a sword gleaming at his side. A man who refused to live quietly and instead lived entirely. His story endures because it teaches something simple and eternal, that one person, one spirit lit by conviction can challenge the impossible and win. And as long as his story is told, Mad Jack Churchill will never leave us. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.